Okay, hi everyone. If you guys could take your seats, we're gonna get started. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining tonight's Link event, Breaking Through the Fog of War, Challenges and Responsibilities of Reporting Under Fire in 2023. Today's panel discussion will be followed by Q&A with our in-person audience. After around 30 minutes, our moderator will announce when it's time for audience questions. At this time, you can make your way to the microphones, which are gonna be located in the aisles, so like right there and right there. If you're new to the Link program, welcome. My colleague Shayna Katz is gonna tell you a little bit more about the Link program now.
So LINK stands for Learn, Inform, Network, Know, and it's the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's Young Professionals Program. We host a variety of events throughout the year aimed at deepening our understandings of key topics in foreign affairs, as well as the different career paths available to young professionals interested in foreign affairs.
We have an outstanding panel this evening, and it is our pleasure to now introduce the members of our distinguished panel. Joining us in person tonight is Missy Ryan, who is a reporter covering diplomacy and national security for the Washington Post. She has reported from Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Lebanon, Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Mexico, Peru, Argentina, and Chile. And Tracy Wilkinson, who is a foreign affairs correspondent at the Los Angeles Times Washington Bureau. She has covered wars, crises, and the daily life on 3 continents.
Joining us virtually is Deborah Amos, and she is an international correspondent for NPR. She has recently covered the Syrian and Iraqi refugee crisis, the economy in the Middle East, and the Arab youth surge. She previously reported for ABC's Nightline and PBS's Frontline.
The discussion will be moderated by the Washington Institute's Friedman Fellow, Haneen Gadar. She is the former managing editor of Lebanon's Now News website, where she shed light on a broad range of cutting-edge issues, from the evolution of Hezbollah inside Lebanon's fractured political system to Iran's growing influence throughout the Middle East. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to Haneen to kick off the discussion.
Thank you very much, Link team, for this amazing panel. I had nothing to do with it, but I'm so happy I'm here. Thank you all for coming, and to this, I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion. We are going to start a discussion with me asking the panelists questions, and Deb, welcome.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you join us.
It's nice to be a big head right behind you. Thank you.
That's great. So I will ask general questions, and if you all want to answer them, if one of you prefers to answer these questions, please go ahead. This is going to take around 30 minutes, and then we open the floor for Q&A, another 30 minutes, and then we have hard stop at 8 because someone wants to leave at 8. I think Deb has to go at 8. We have 1 hour for the discussion. I'm sure it's going to be enough. And I would definitely like the young professionals here to take it for the opportunity of this panel and ask all the questions you want about covering conflicts. So we definitely want to talk about conflicts in the Middle East, but we're going to take also advantage that our panelists have covered the Middle East and beyond. So we are expanding the discussion to talk about covering conflict in general, and with some examples from the Middle East, of course, but we know that their experience in conflicts around the world, from the Middle East, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, everywhere. And someone has just returned from Ukraine as well, so we'd like to talk about that. So let me start without further ado with my first question, which is basically the question that everybody has in mind. I think covering conflicts in the Middle East and the world in general has become even harder and much more challenging for women, especially for women. Not only for reporters in general are in danger. We've seen reports by press organizations, media organizations, human rights organizations everywhere indicating that challenges to journalists covering conflict is becoming much, much higher. But I know that for women, it's even much more difficult. So in your experience, what are the main dangers today of reporting from conflict zones? And what do you think your media institutions, but also other media institutions in general are doing today to keep journalists safe? Deb, you want to start, and then we go.
Sure.
Yeah. I would challenge just a small bit about, is it more dangerous for women? I think it's more dangerous for all of us, simply because, and some conflicts more than others. Ukraine was particularly dangerous because you had no idea where it was coming down. And I mean, I always thought that women actually had an advantage in the field. There are some problems with that, but now the danger is simply we'll all get blown up. I was in Berlin when Ukraine started, and I began to worry about nuclear fallout in the beginning of that war. That doesn't have anything to do with my gender. So I would just define the premise a little tighter.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm echoing what Deb said. I would say that, there's a couple of things. I do think that, there are probably more women out there today than there were, a generation ago. And I think that, it really speaks to, increased opportunities for women in asserting they want to be on the front lines and doing those things. But I do, in the Middle East specifically, I do see sort of advantages and disadvantages of being a woman. And I'm thinking about, covering the conflicts of the last dozen years or so. My experience in Afghanistan is that, often you had access that men couldn't have, that a Western male reporter wouldn't be able to have in terms of speaking to women, the wives, the mother of a particular family, because that would be forbidden for a unrelated man to come in to certain parts of the household or whatever. So in some ways, it could be an entry point. But then, in the Arab Spring uprisings, for example, there were women who were targeted, foreign Western women journalists who were targeted. I would just say too that the other element I think to all of this is, as these conflicts become more about an information war, and we're certainly seeing this with Ukraine more than any other conflict in history, an online disinformation and information conflict. I think that there are some elements of gender that come into that, in that women, I think, in all fields online have a certain vulnerability and are targeted for harassment in ways that men aren't always. And I think that maybe there is some tie in there to female journalists, but I do agree with Deb that the especially in a place like Ukraine, it is sort of an equal opportunity risk for, if you're driving in a car, whether or not you get shelled, or if you happen to be in a city that is being targeted for airstrikes.
Yes, I agree with both Missy and Deb that, on the one hand, there have been places where I, as a woman, had access that men didn't. I remember in the Sinai with the Bedouin, I could go and meet with the entire female family and really get the story that you wouldn't have gotten just talking to the men. And so, you do try to use it as an advantage when you can. But yeah, women can be tortured and harassed in ways that men can't. But I do think, as both of my colleagues said, overall, as these conflicts evolve, it is not as much of a gender-based thing as I think it might have been one day. It's more, the firepower of the combatants is different and evolving and worse. And our own ability to train and prepare has evolved. And so I don't see a gender factor in that, or a sex factor in that. But there are times, I remember, God, when I began, before all of you were born in Central America, the interior minister would go, "Hey, sweetie, how are you doing?" There was a lot of that.
Yeah.
I don't think that happens as much anymore. I hope, maybe just because I'm too old, but anyway, but I do think now it is more, as Missy said, kind of more equal opportunity access or denial of access, and harassment or lack thereof.
So maybe here, before we go to the safety issues, I think the difference from like you're talking about this, and I'm thinking about my own experience and my Lebanese journalist peers' experience and Arabs. I think that the difference here is between local versus foreign.
Yeah.
And when it comes to women, or also men journalists, for the locals, it's a completely different issue when it comes to safety and gender differences. And I know from personal experience as a woman journalist back in Lebanon, it was much more difficult. So maybe for Western foreign journalists, it's safer, not safer in that terms, but I mean, it's different when it comes to gender issue, whether there's a gender issue or not.
Can I ask you, can you say, like, how did that play out for local journalists, female journalists in Lebanon?
Harassment mostly.
Okay.
Harassment is number one, I think, and there have been reports for a lot of harassment against female journalists, not just in Lebanon, in the Arab world, and there are reports out there on local media and regional media, regional institutions. The other issue is that women in the region, I think, they are not taken seriously as men in the sense that they can actually cover politics and be responsible or senior enough. I used to get phone calls asking me, we need to talk to Mr. Gaddar, because no one could even imagine for a second that this editor-in-chief of this website is actually a woman. So this is, being taken seriously and at the same time more open to harassment. But I think in that sense, when I thought about women, I was thinking from my own perspective, but maybe it's different. So.
Well, just last week, the State Department awarded these Women of Courage awards that they do every year. But there was one woman there, an Ethiopian journalist. And I was really fascinated by her story because she's trying to cover, gender violence issues in this Ethiopian Tigrayan war. And it's terrible. It's awful. And it's still going on despite the truce. And she's been repeatedly imprisoned, harassed constantly. And, so someone like her, I think she probably has access to the women more than a male journalist would.
That's true.
But she's also, just fighting incredible prejudice and discrimination.
But,
it was like that for us. And I think that it's just, it's a time period. I find in the field, I see a lot of young women journalists who are Middle Eastern, Ukrainian, Syrian, and they kind of remind me of us 15, 20 years ago. I started out my career as an affirmative action hire. But there was a moment in American law where you had to have one of us. And you didn't have to have two, you just had to have one. And, we don't do that anymore. And I always tell this story about a young woman, Korean American, who came to my office and asked me, how did you start? And I said, I was an affirmative action hire. And she looked for a minute and she said, but what were you? And I thought, oh, good, we won. Okay, then if you're asking a question like that, then we won.
That's amazing.
So I do think that Middle Eastern journalists are just a bit behind us and are coming along, and their numbers are changing, and that's just the way it works.
Yeah, I hope we get there at one point. That looking at the Middle East, how it's moving, it doesn't seem like moving forward in that direction, but I hope I'm wrong. I just want to go the second part of the question, which is about the safety measures, and you said something about training has evolved. The institutions are doing more in terms of protecting journalists, and can you talk
Sure. No, exactly. When I started, again, we're talking the 80s, before all of you were born, and the wars in Central America, and no one heard of training journalists for safety or first aid or any of that. But now I think today it's required. Everyone has to be trained. I think most news institutions now require training of their reporters before they're sent into a war zone. So that's a huge difference. And, at the minimum, it's first aid, and sometimes it's even more elaborate than that, like, evasive driving and how to duck and, protect your ears from a airstrike or whatever. But that is something that has evolved in the last couple of decades. And, these obviously technology has evolved incredibly. I mean, when I again started, it was, Deb might remember this, it was the Trash 80, that little laptop that we got from Radio Shack. No cell phones, and satellite phones that were as big as a bus. I mean, it was crazy. And all of that has evolved too, and that makes us more nimble and more better prepared, safer. And those are important evolutions that have happened. Of course, at the same time, that the enemy, or in other words, the combatants, have evolved in their firepower and the lethality of their instruments, and in their refusal to recognize rules of war, which, once upon a time meant something, and I don't think do anymore. So all of these things are.
So just to follow up on this, when if you can give us an example of like what you can and cannot do.
What I can and cannot do in
a war zone.
In a war zone.
What are the limits basically for you to be safe? Like where?
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think it's dictated by the different news organizations have dramatically different thresholds for what they're going to allow people to do. Some news organizations employ security advisors to go along with journalists. Some news organizations don't. Some people have, specific staff dedicated to, advising and tracking reporters in the field. All of this is extremely expensive. A lot of news organizations just can't afford to do those kind of things. And so, other journalists either don't get to go to those places, or they do so in a way that's less, or just, has less oversight, and, either they're lucky or not. And, obviously, even with all of the right precautions, you still could be very unlucky. So, I worked for Reuters when I worked in the Middle East, and had a very different sort of appetite for risk than other organizations. We were very risk averse because Reuters had a number of local journalists killed during the Iraq War in various encounters with the U.S. military and in terrorist attacks. So, I think I don't know what PR is like these days, but, the Post is certainly doing a lot to try to keep people safe in Ukraine as we cover this war. But, of course, if there's going to be a tactical nuclear strike, nobody can do anything against that.
So I think part of the reason that this training is so ubiquitous, and it wasn't before, certainly when I was coming up, and that is because of the insurance companies. That's who's asking for it. And so our management has all been forced to do it. And I think it is a good thing for us. Ours is a lot of first aid, a lot of it. Tourniquets, people bleed out, they do. And that is something that you need to learn. An interesting thing happened this year, I think. Most of this training, of course, is for people who go to war zones. But I remember coming back to the States, and as a member of the Overseas Press Club, we started watching the demonstrations in the United States, and they looked very, very familiar to what we were, dealing with in the Middle East. And we actually put on a training for freelance journalists because we thought, God, this, they are using bullets, people are losing eyes, all the things that we had to learn in the Middle East. Now, domestic reporters have to learn as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. For January 6th, my office was distributing gas masks and bulletproof vests and the whole thing. And I kind of thought, oh my gosh, this is Washington, D.C. and we're doing this.
Yep.
Yeah, one thing, just to add two things on that. First of all, I would say that unfortunately, a lot of the times the local journalists that work with foreign reporters don't get the same kind of training.
That was going to be my next question.
And that I think is really unfortunate. And then the second thing I would add is that I do think it's positive that a lot of news organizations have started to think more about the mental health of people who are covering conflicts and making resources available to. I know when I worked at Reuters, there was that they had a program where people could call and have access to a therapist. Not everybody took advantage of that, but you had journalists who had been covering the conflict in Iraq or Syria or wherever for years and had seen a lot of people get hurt or die. And just the fact of media companies sort of being aware of that and taking advantage of that and thinking about things like moral hazard in sending people into these conflicts, I think is a really positive thing, although, certainly that task is not complete in terms of assisting people in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, in one of my stints in Baghdad, several of us got blown up in a suicide bomber at a restaurant, and they would not let me go back to work until I had seen a
Oh, really?
psychiatrist.
Oh, that's
But
good.
at the same time, we were very careful about making sure all of our Iraqi employees who were there with us at that night got complete medical care.
Oh,
And
that's
so,
nice.
you know,
That's great.
it's a good point that
Yeah.
often the local journalists don't get the same attention, and freelance journalists
Yeah.
don't get the same attention. I mean,
Yeah.
Deb, Missy, and I are lucky enough to have major institutions behind us, but a lot of journalists don't have that. Even American journalists don't
Yeah,
have that.
totally.
So it's a really important consideration.
And if you've noticed, the DART Center is starting to put names of therapists up on their website.
That's great.
Because it's hard to ask, because we're such a specialized group. You know, you can't, I hate to say this, but you can't go to just anybody. You know, you need somebody that understands what we do, even down to, you know, often it's said that like photographers have the worst reactions because we at least process our stories. We have to make a narrative out of what we see. And that in some ways gets it all kind of settled in your head where it's supposed to be. You know, PTSD is when it doesn't get processed. So, you know, that's why it's important that the DART Center is starting to put up people who specialize in working with journalists.
That's good to know. Make sure they spread the word here. That was actually, this was something I wanted to ask about the local journalists. And it's good that some organizations are providing medical care, maybe some insurance here and there. Not necessarily everybody's covered, but some are starting to consider it. But there are two issues to this that are still debated. I hear it all the time from friends and colleagues and a lot of people on the ground in the Middle East, like locals. One is that safety and this kind of training, even if provided, there's a different element to that, which is they do not feel safe in the first place. The way the people, like officials and militias and regimes, deal with the locals is very different the way they deal with foreign journalists. And you all know that because they want to make the foreign journalists think that they are the good guys, so they deal with the locals. So this is a starting point for them. It's not about if something happens to them, what would the institutions do? It's what are the institutions doing to keep them safe from, you know, that kind of backlash from regimes only because they're working with foreign news. So is it something that you see, you hear? Do you think that any media institution, Western media institutions, doing anything about this? And the other issue also, of course, is the other side of this, is that most of the reporters, writers, people who are actually covering the conflict are Westerners, and most of the stringers and fixers are locals. So there's also this kind of a division that they don't feel safe unless they become part of the institution as journalists, and it's a really harder process. So this is also something, it's a debate out there in the region, and it's something that I hear all the time. So I don't know if anyone wants to talk a little bit about that. Is there anything, is the debate reaching the media institutions in the West and getting somewhere?
You know, I will say something about this. I'm not sure if home base can really understand what the problems are for local journalists, local fixers. I think we understand it better than our bosses, and so much of protection is very subtle. I've worked with fixers who we both know the places that if I'm not accompanied by my fixer, it's because he doesn't want to have to tell where I've been. I get it, he gets it, we don't talk about it, we just do it. And there's all kinds of examples like that in the field where you just have to stand back and let your local journalist, local fixer, you know, be responsible for what happens next, because they know better than you do what's safe and what's not, what you can talk about, what you can't, where they can go, where they can't, so that at least you have some sort of working relationship.
Okay, That's good. All right. Anyone wants to comment on that before we go on? I think we have 10 minutes or 2 more questions. So.
Okay.
You go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Let me just like ask the 2 questions and then let you both let you the 3 of you answer. The main issue really here is the competition, which is not really a competition for me because that's like old school journalists. Like I only believe in traditional journalists. Like this all social media for me is not journalism, and it's an expression where everybody has the right to express. But there is also a lot of competition in terms of a lot of people today read less news, watch less news, read less actually in-depth reporting, which is and moving more of the social media and social media pundits, if you want. This is really, this leads me to the second question, which is with less readers, less ads, less money, what is the future of journalism?
Oh,
I mean,
Lord.
are you asking about journalism about conflicts specifically, or just generally?
Yes, conflicts actually is a big part of it because conflict costs most money.
It does.
Like a lot
it
of
does,
money
yeah.
is being spent on covering conflicts, right?
Yeah, I
Safety
mean,
issues. And also because in conflicts, you have a lot of disinformation. So social media becomes the biggest tool. So I think covering conflict is a big part of this kind of competition and dynamics. So yes.
I mean, the question of the future of journalism, I feel like we might be here till next Thursday, but okay. So like in terms of, covering conflicts, I mean, I feel really happy that the Washington Post specifically appears to be really committed to investing in strong, robust coverage of Ukraine. We have, a small bureau in Kyiv, but we have a constantly rotating staff of, text reporters, photographers, video people who are out in the East doing, stuff that I think really helps people understand what's happening there. But that's certainly not the case, for us in the media for many other conflicts, like when is the last time you saw a Western reporter, a big news organization spend a lot of space on Yemen or, Ethiopia or exactly. Right. Or, Libya. And so I think that some of this has to do with, the sort of Western gaze and what, what we think our readers care about and what are sort of, what the US government, because we're here in Washington, is focusing on at that moment. So on one hand, I think Ukraine is really important, but I do wish that, we had unlimited resources to tell those other stories in a way that, the people who are sort of trapped in them deserve. Sometimes social media can help bridge the gap in places where we're not covering things, either because, a shortage of personnel or, sometimes you can't get to places because they're too unsafe. Like when we were covering, the war in Syria, like we didn't have people on the ground regularly during the ISIS period. And so we relied on, activists and people who were able to speak to outsiders, and that certainly helps, but it's a poor substitute for actually being there. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, no, I agree. And although we are still covering Ukraine as best we can, because we're the Los Angeles Times, we focus on Mexico and Central America and Latin, where there are wars. I mean, there is conflict, and so that's where we have kind of focused our efforts and money. But it is very expensive, as you say, to cover conflict. Be it the security or the resources or whatever. And in Mexico, what we try to do, I was the bureau chief for 7 years, we try to really have a network of people who can work with us and tell us what's happening, because government is useless and the security service, whatever. But anyway, so to answer your question, I think it is something that we are all still pursuing, but not probably in the same. I mean, back in the day, we had 30 bureaus all over the world, and we don't have that anymore. And so now, we have to focus on areas. I mean, even the Post that has a much larger footprint in overseas, I think you also have to pick and choose a little bit.
For sure.
So, that's just the reality, and that's what we have to do. Trying to find really important. I mean, I think Mexico is very important, and I'm really glad we dedicate time and effort to that. But yeah, we miss a lot of other things. So,
NPR still has a very robust foreign desk. We sent quite a few, 4 or 5, I think, for earthquake coverage, and we've got one still there. We were sending 5 reporters in rotation into Ukraine in the beginning. Now there's a bureau chief and a rotation. So NPR is known for international coverage, but I want to mention one thing about the future of journalism, because I teach it, and I am, for the first time in the fall, I had students, the youngest person in the class, who said, I don't read a newspaper, and I believed her. But it's not that she didn't know the news. She did, but she gets it from other ways, from podcasts, from social media, all kinds of ways. She's very well informed, but she doesn't know what a lead is. She doesn't know what a nut graph is. She doesn't know what a source is. That was terrifying, because I hadn't seen that before. And I think that so I've been asking myself, how much of this do you have to know now to be a journalist in this world now? I think you do have to know those things, because they represent the way that we do things, the way that we check, the way that we gather facts. All that is about that. So I still think you need to know those things in journalism. But it's daunting to think about the future of journalism, not so much about money and do we cover conflict, but how people get their news and how we respond to that.
Do you see this as a trend across the board, or just
NPR's on Instagram more than it's any place else. When did you know about that? And we're all like being told, you really need to do these things. And I think that is correct. We do. But so where does all the journalistic rigor go in doing the news on TikTok? It's a different kind of news, but I think we need both, and that's what keeps me up at night.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. So I think it's time to open the floor, and perfect timing, because I have a lot more questions. I asked the main questions I have not here, but if we have more time, I'll keep going.
Okay.
But I think it's fair to just open the floor to Q&A from our guests.
Yeah, so feel free to come up to either of the microphone if you have any questions. And thanks so much again for the illuminating discussion.
Okay, so I have a question about trying to keep the balance between objectivity in your journalism while also being there on the ground. I can imagine that obviously covering a war on the ground, it has a huge emotional impact on you. So how do you sort of keep that balance in what you're writing while still being empathetic and understanding what people are going through on the ground?
Who are you asking?
I think it's a good question. I think that for me, it's not so different than, how do you maintain objectivity in any situation? I mean, the thing that makes it different, I guess, potentially, is just the intensity of what you're seeing and hearing from people in certain contexts when you're covering a conflict. But, the way I do that is just to zoom in on one person's experience and try to provide the context of the larger conflict that we would do, in any situation. And we use, our judgment, like the Washington Post, we described the, illegal annexation of Crimea and, the illegal invasion of Ukraine. And, so we use our judgment and analytical skills in a way that, we hope provides objective context, but isn't sort of he said, she said ism in a way that wouldn't be helpful for readers and viewers.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, in fact, several of my colleagues and I who've gone back over years in some of these wars, and we've been talking a lot the last few days about objectivity and does it exist? Can it exist? We saw during the Trump administration, if you try to make, equal parts of absurd things, it's not right. But I think Missy's right that what you do in these wars, you try to tell the story of the civilians, the people who are suffering, and you can, get the broader politics in there as well. But for me, it was always tell the story of the people. And in Bosnia, I was in Bosnia for years, and this is when Christian Amanpour famously decided objectivity was no longer a thing. And so it was the Bosnians who were mostly suffering. The Serbs wouldn't let us into their country, so that ended that. But the idea is just to show what the civilians are suffering. I mean, that's the closest I can get to objectivity, I think.
Also, we do have editors. It's not like we're here by ourselves. I mean, I had one of these today. I was doing a story about Saddam Hussein's trial 20 years ago. And,
oh my God.
Yeah, I know. And one of my interviews said those men in the room were acting like baboons, but that would be giving baboons a bad name. And I thought, wow, can I use that? And it's one of those moral questions that you have. I'm not sure if I can. And so, I mean, I think I liked it because of the way he said it. It was just kind of funny. And my editor said, absolutely not. No, you cannot. You cannot call people monkeys on the air. You cannot. So
the scary part of this is that this happened 20 years ago.
Pardon?
Can you believe it? 20 years ago, the war.
20 years ago, I know. Yeah. So, I mean, this is an ongoing conversation in newsrooms all the time.
All the time. Yes. I know. Yeah. We're not machines at the end of the day, and we have feelings when you're on the ground, especially, and seeing things with your own eyes. And there's always also the debate on neutrality versus objectivity. This is another debate. Please go ahead.
Hi, yes, Brooke Sherman. I work for the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Thank you so much for this discussion. So I'm wondering, you actually made a very brief comment about this. So as governments in the Middle East are becoming increasingly more daring with blocking journalism, you had referenced targeting a lot of local journalists, but we're also seeing them restrict access to the country for even foreign journalists, especially in the Gulf, but even more so in countries in the other subregions. So I'm wondering how this has affected either your work or if it's ever, really kind of gotten in the way of reporting a story, or how you frame a story, and how you kind of balance maintaining access legally with also, keeping the story intact, if you will.
Thank you. Let's take this.
Yeah, I mean, that it's difficult for journalists to get access to Saudi Arabia, American journalists at least, to get access to Saudi Arabia, for example. We have a bureau in Cairo, but there's increasing media restrictions for everybody in Egypt. We don't have reporters in government-controlled parts of Syria. There's a lot of restrictions on reporting in other countries in the region. And it definitely makes it harder to tell those stories. I would love to read a lot of articles about, sort of breaking down the dynamics in Saudi society and how people are really feeling about the changes that, the economic changes, the social changes versus the, online and political repression and all of that. But, reporters aren't able to do that. And that, I think, is a real detriment for everybody, because, then the conversation is that much less informed. We try to do what we can, but it's it's unfortunate, and there's a reason why a lot of the governments don't let people in.
Yeah, and even with access to a place like Saudi Arabia, you'd be given a minder, and so it would be you'd be very limited in what you could do, unfortunately.
Yeah, didn't used to be like that, and Saudi was really an amazing place, and it just pains me because you're right. There's so much we're missing about the story there, and we haven't seen it now in years.
And then I would just say, the situation is so much worse for the local journalists. Like, in a place like Egypt, foreign reporters are largely sheltered from, any, for the kind of legal ramifications, largely sheltered so far. There was the Al Jazeera people, I think it was, a number of years ago, but they were released, at least the foreigners were. And, so the local journalists always take more risks.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it's home, so we gotta want to.
But throughout the world, same in Mexico, same in Central America, throughout the world, that's the case.
Probably more invested.
Yeah.
Because it's for career and also.
And we can leave, the foreigners can leave, sadly.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
100%. You always have the option. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I was just wondering, when dealing with prolonged conflicts that go on for many, many years, how you or your outlets approach continuing to keep with the story, especially if shock value has died down, how you handle reporting the story with new angles, especially if there's no end in sight for a conflict, and what it looks like to approach that in the field, especially when they're highly complex, but maybe many of the original takes have already been described.
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think we've all dealt with it as journalists, like the media institutions and the policy always jumps on the hot news. And also Syria, for example, look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at all these places where the conflict is ongoing, but there's less appetite to cover these stories because, there are other things that are much like Ukraine, for example, right? So I think this is a very important topic, and
no, that's certainly true. That there is fatigue after a certain point in these, and then another crisis comes up, another war comes up, and it is very hard to sustain that. I think our different outlets try to do what they can in terms of particular conflicts, but it's the dilemma that we have.
Part of it is, isn't it, though, that, our business is at NEW, and if it's not new, we don't do it. So, I mean, I've been thinking about this for, the war crimes trials in Germany for the Syrians. So, people kind of went out for the first one, the big one, the one that we hadn't seen before, Colonel. There's been 3 more. There's no coverage, 0. And I feel bad about that, but I don't think I can sell it because it's not NEW, it's not new. We had one, we had a war crimes trial, and that's the end of that. So that happens with some stories where something that looks like a trend gets covered, and then the day-to-day just
like Lebanon's crisis, for example, like
Correct.
2019 was the moment when everybody wanted to talk about Lebanon again and the protests and the crisis, and it's still going on, but you don't see it anywhere, except like for people who actually follow this on a daily basis, they know about it. Otherwise, you think that Lebanon is back on its feet. It's not, actually, it's worse. But because nothing big is happening. So if something happened 3 years ago, the media covers it for 2-3 months, and then nothing really big happened except slow decay. Slow decay kills the story.
Human attention span is limited.
Yes.
It's the reality.
1 year later, the 4th explosion in Beirut, right? Again, people came back because it's big, and then slow decay. So they went back. So now if something else happens in Lebanon, so now people in Lebanon, for example, is like, let's just create a crisis because we need the media to cover it. They can't, even that. But yeah, definitely, it's a problem. And again, probably if institutions have more staff in the region, more ways of covering it, more pages, more readers, that would actually be maybe.
I would just say one other thing. I do think that, so, I had just happened to be in Ukraine just now for the 1 year, anniversary. And my hotel was like totally packed in, the week before the anniversary. And then afterwards, like most of the journalists cleared out. And I think, because it becomes expensive and because it's as the questioner said, like, a lot of the angles have been covered. But I do think, and I covered Iraq. I was in Iraq in 2008, 2010. So it was like, as the surge troops were being pulled out and Iraq was gradually getting safer at that time. And it definitely got less attention at that time because, Afghanistan was heating up. And I do think that it, sort of puts the onus on us covering those conflicts at those moments to try to like up our game too. The stories don't just tell themselves. You get, the fortunate thing is you have a little space to, be a little bit more deliberate about trying to find stories. But, the way I thought about it at the time is you've just got to be that much, you have to bring your A game even more to find stories that are compelling to bring people back to those narratives or those topics.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, thank you all for being here. My name is Suda. We're here with the Turkey program. I have two questions, if that's okay. So the first one, I was wondering how you as a foreigner in these contexts can build trust with your sources and how the access, even figuring out who to talk to, takes place for you. And also I'm wondering how your families feel or react to this very dangerous line of work and how you navigate that. And I'm wondering about your experience with that. Thank you so much.
Oh yeah,
Families. Yeah. Well, we were talking about local journalists, right, and how important they are to our work. And so certainly in a lot of these places that I've worked from, Iraq, Jerusalem, Mexico, over time, we develop a group of people that we trust who can then help us learn about the local situation and know who to talk to and know who to trust and know what's, crap and what's true and that sort of thing. And so I think we've done a pretty good job with that in most of the countries that we've worked in. Some places it's more difficult. If you like show up in a country that you've not been in for years, Haiti, the earthquake in 2010, no one to work with. And there were a bunch of guys who had been in jail in the United States and been deported back to Haiti, and they became our translators. So, you're going off with the convict to be your translator. So there are problems, but, generally in most of these places where we have a more, steady presence, that's what you do. You just build and build and build trust with the people that you have working with you and for you and that sort of thing. The family, I don't know, both my parents were journalists. And so they're like, oh yeah, well, she's off to do that. My husband was a journalist.
Interesting.
My sister's a journalist, so we just we're like not a lot of imagination in my family. We're all the same thing. And I think that's how I dealt with it. No, I never had children. So Missy can talk about maybe that aspect. But I just wasn't from a journalism family, and it's what you do. Missy?
Yeah, so I think in terms of building trust, everything that Tracy said, and then, obviously language skills are always really helpful. Just if you can have a conversation rather than having to go through a translator. The family thing,
Should I not have mentioned that? I'm
Oh,
sorry.
no, I was just saying, like, sometimes you just don't tell people where you're going until you're back. And
Yeah.
that's sort of always my strategy. Oh, I'm not leaving the bureau today, don't worry. And now I have a small child, and so I'm like, more risk averse than I used to be. So I don't do things that I probably would say. Yeah, and that's why, I just went to Ukraine, and I was in Kyiv the whole time. I didn't go out to the front lines. I have colleagues who are out doing those things, but for me, it's just not something that I want to do right now. So
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Good for you. I was married to a journalist. That helps. And I didn't tell my parents until I got back. Got caught at it once. And it was a bad thing. I got hit in the back of the head 5 stitches later. And my husband, who filmed it, because he was a journalist too, put it on television. And hadn't warned my father that he was going to see this. Anyway, I find that the new generation of female journalists are more likely to have kids in the field and say things like, I'm sorry, I can't go for more than a week because I have to be back for my kid, and get away with it. And I say bravo to that, because we couldn't when we got in. So there's a lot of people in my generation that didn't have children for that reason. So it has, I think it's changed for women in the time that since I started.
It changed a little bit here, but they're still the same
For some, I'm sure.
for some.
I'm sure.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a very difficult choice to make. But yeah. So you're good.
I was
You're
going to
next.
go ahead. You have a nicer suit, so go ahead.
This is for everyone. Again, thank you for the lively conversation. Alec Davison, I used to be a former intern here. Shout out, FICRA program. So what is some career advice that you could share with us that you wish someone had told you when you were our age, for young professionals specifically? Thank you.
Career advice for people. Career advice for people who want to be journalists, or people who want to.
Sorry, like foreign affairs, want to study the world and go travel around.
Yeah. My advice would be that, there's no substitute for getting like the overseas experience, whatever that is and whatever the place is. I think, you go out and spend some time, and then, you'll come back with just a more, different perspective. And then the advice I always give to people who are, starting off in journalism is that, there's no set path that you need to take. When I was coming up, when I was just starting to get in, there very much was a prescribed path where people started at, small papers, then medium, then, regional bureaus of big papers. And a lot of those smaller organizations don't exist anymore. And so, you can, and my own path was not that. And so, you can jump around and try different things. And, you can make it work. And so, I would say, I don't think that people should feel discouraged if they don't start off in a place that they think they
Learn how to write in English, learn how to write well, and then learn a foreign language.
Oh yeah.
That's my advice.
Definitely learn a foreign language.
Yes, and read papers outside the United States.
Yes.
Smart. Yeah.
Yes.
And I want to add to that basically that you will learn a lot more from the street than from government palaces, presidential palaces,
or think tanks.
Military leaders. They will tell you nonsense, and you will be happy with the accent, but it means nothing. The street will tell you a lot more about you.
Definitely.
Right.
Correct.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Hi.
My name's Todd Wiggins. My website's called meetmedmv.com. I started off in journalism 30 years ago plus, working for newspapers and then USA Today. But my primary question to you is your philosophical, your feelings. Think of yourselves as, let's say, now. What have you learned? Would it be something along the lines of the more things change, the more things stay the same? In 30 years, we haven't gotten beyond conflict in general, and we're using more advanced technology. So are we better than we were when you were younger, or have we not learned?
He points to me.
Well, because you said
about
your lineage. Well, lineage-wise, what have we learned in the last 4 decades? Do you feel that humanity is better or not, or not even close to being what it should be by now?
This is going to take us until next week. Do you have time?
Yeah.
We still are confronting so many conflicts, and in some ways they're worse, in some ways they're not. You mentioned social media, that's been this double-edged sword where suddenly, yes, we have a lot more information, but we have a lot more disinformation. And I mean, Deb can talk about this better than I, but the war crimes prosecutions, now we're getting evidence in real time, which is great. In the Bosnian War, the Serbs were hiding mass graves that you couldn't get. It took, years to get cases in the Bosnian War. And now, it's real time, but it's overwhelming and it's more than the system can deal with. So it's just really such a mixed bag in terms of progress or not. I mean,
and on that one, it's political will. It doesn't matter how much evidence you got. If you don't have the political will to take it to court, it doesn't matter. That's the thing that I've learned over time from Nuremberg till now. Yeah, we got tons of evidence, but you can't get it to the ICC because the Department of Defense doesn't want to cooperate, even though there's a new law that says that we can. Like, what is that? So, I'm these days I'm on the accountability beat. I've decided that's how I'm going out.
I would say, that sadly, that I don't think that things are that much better off. We saw, the conflicts that I covered for a long time were, insurgent, irregular wars, where, people did horrific things to civilians. And now we're going to find out what a large scale conventional war is like. And we're finding that out now. And the reason why I feel discouraged is because you see some of the things that are happening on the Russian side in Ukraine. And it's not just like, hitting buildings that, purportedly had a military conflict, were purportedly a military target, but there's, rape and torture and, children being killed. And it's hard to believe that that can happen in the 21st century. But then you think about Syria and chemical weapons attacks in the 21st century, and Assad is still there. And so, I wish I was more optimistic, but it's hard to understand how, we in this day and age can allow these things to happen, but we do.
We have 2 more minutes. We can go on, but I think that needs to go.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. I do. So I'm going to say bye, and I'm so sorry I'm not there. You have no idea. I would have loved to have been there.
So good to have you. It's
good to see you, Deb.
It was great having you here. Thank you so much, and good luck with.
Use up your 2 minutes. Bye.
Bye.
All right. So, if anyone has another question, please.
Just thank you all so much for being here. I'm glad there's interest.
Oh. Yeah.
Hi.
It's a very quick question.
Denmark question. Not really a question, but I was at the State Department for many years, and one of my last assignments was as a public affairs officer. And actually, my experience was very different. So I, the ambassador would have the American members of the foreign press over for lunch once a month.
What country?
Peru.
What years?
2006 to 2009. So we would meet, with the press.
And
yeah. So, not a conflict zone, but that kind of sharing of sort of information was very positive. So my experience was very, with this, with the media was positive and constructive. So.
Yeah.
So I thought I would throw that in because it was often very negative but there are some good sides.
Yes, those are good things too. Those are good
Thank
things
you.
too. Thank you.
Thank you all. I don't know if you want to say something before we.
Yeah.
Conclude.
No, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for coming today, and a huge thank you to our amazing panel. We're so thrilled to have you here in person.
China and Anna from the lead team for organizing this. This is all them. Thank you for having me as well, so asking me to moderate this panel. And I'm really, really happy to have this
Yeah,
discussion.
nice
We
to meet
highlighted
you.
many important, significant, and really thorny issues that we still need to discuss and still need to go for access. Like nothing is, there's no like quick solution to any of that. But thank you for the great work that you've been doing and for really like helping us understand the world. So
Thank you.
thanks for
Thank
being
you.
here. Thank you all for coming.